Hey everybody, Cookies here. It is time to talk about Resto Druid raid healing now. So again, we're going to break it down into different categories, so use the timestamps down below if you'd like to skip through certain things. First thing is we're going to just talk about general builds, talents, legendaries, all that stuff. So starting off with just the talents, currently you're going to see a lot of the main talents that I'm going to talk about are Abundance, we have Soul of the Forest, we have Spring Blossoms, and we have Flourish. Okay, so there's a few differences here that you're going to see. First off, Abundance is pretty much always going to be taken. This is just because it synergizes really well with Vision of Unending Growth. The more rejuves we have out, the more efficient our regrowths are. Simple as that. Next up is, I guess if we want to talk about affinities, Balance Affinity is the only one that actually gives you a technical HPS increase since it increases the range of your abilities. Which slightly benefits us being able to reach more players in the party and stuff like that, or in the raid. Next up is Soul of the Forest. You only take this talent if you have your 4-piece already. If you do not have your 4-piece tier bonus, you should be taking Tree of Life. It's just overall, the only reason this is taken is because it has direct synergy with our tier set, so that when we proc that Tree of the Forest with our tier set, we have a Soul of the Forest buff going into it, and it basically just makes our wild growths a lot stronger. So I would typically recommend running this talent only if you have your 4-piece. Next up is Spring Blossoms. You're pretty much going to see this in every fight, except where you cannot stack with the raid, or like the raid cannot be grouped up. So on fights, like the best example of where you won't see Spring Blossoms ever is Halandris. Like right here, I could literally probably go on Halandris, and I would almost guarantee that no one has Spring Blossoms. Okay, there is one person that took it. Let's see if we see anybody else. No. So one log on all the Halandris kills so far that have happened where a Druid has Spring Blossoms. So, and that is because there's never a point in the fight where the raid can be properly stacked up, because there's just so many mechanics that are requiring you to be spread out around the encounter space, and that's where Inner Peace is a better talent. Inner Peace can also be good on certain fights, so like you'll see it a lot on Desagne, and the reason for that is because it lines up with each time that the boss casts her channel ability. So if I go to like a random log of Desagne, for instance, and then I look at enemy cast. Hopefully this loads quick enough so I can just kind of get there. And then we want to look at, I believe it is called, it would just be the Teleport and Inevitable Dominion. So we'll just count it as the teleport. So as you can see here, she teleports at 1 and then 3:20. So that's exactly 2 minutes away. And then again, 3:20 and 5:29. So every 2 minutes, she's going to do a teleport. So if you take that Inner Peace talent, it's going to make it to where now all of a sudden you have a Trink for every single one of those teleports, which is very beneficial. There's also other fights like it, like I believe Lords of Dread. If you take Inner Peace, you'll have it up for every single time that Mal'Ganis does the Swarm of Decay, which is like the big raid damage ability. So those are fights where you would want to take Inner Peace, or where they're still, they're just beneficial. Like you can still take Spring Blossoms on a fight like Desagne or Lords of Dread because it'll still do a lot of healing. It's just if you feel like you need more cooldown coverage in your group, or you want to have that cooldown coverage, then it's very good to take Inner Peace. Cool. And then the last talent, Flourish Always. There's never another option in this raid tier. There has been in previous raid tiers, but for now we're taking Flourish because it just interacts really well with our legendary setups and all that stuff. Okay, so next up we talk about legendaries and covenants. So the legendaries, they do not change whatsoever. You always run Vision of Unending Growth and you play Night Fae. This is the only... Off the top of my head, this is one of the only healers where your covenant choice really impacts your healing output, like to a whole different extreme than other covenants. So like being Night Fae will give you a massive gain of HPS over other covenants in raid. So with that being said, I'm only going to be talking about Night Fae. I'm not going to cover the other covenants because their abilities are pretty lackluster, and the way you play them is basically just don't use Convoke, and you kind of just play as if you didn't have Convoke, and you don't have much else to go with. And then for Soulbinds and Conduits, always run Dreamweaver. It's the best healing healing Soulbind to run. And then for Conduits, the only ones that we're going to talk about are the potency Conduits that matter, which is Unstoppable Growth, and then your Conflux of the Elements, which is your Night Fae Convoke Conduit. And then the rest, like the Endurance Conduits and the Finesse Conduits, they are all very, very, very strong. Like almost every single Endurance and Finesse Conduit that Druid has access to is good. So just look through them and pick which ones you feel will benefit you the most. Last up, we're going to talk about Trinkets, which, as with all the healers, stat Trinkets are the best. Soul Eating Ruby is especially good on Resto Druid, and again, that's just because it lines up really nicely with every other Convoke, which can give us a lot of extra power on our cooldowns. But otherwise, just take stat Trinkets. Soleil's Secret Technique, Unbound Changeling, you have Soul Eating Ruby, you have the Elegy of the Eternals, and you have the, like, in a pinch, you can run like the Alchemy Stone or the Auxiliary Attendant Chime from the first boss if you have it at a higher eye level than your current Trinkets. But yeah, anything that gives you more stats is just going to be something that gives you stats by itself, and then some kind of on-use effect or just passive ability that gives you even more stats after that. Those will be the best for Resto Druid. Okay, now we're going to talk about actual gameplay. So I'm going to go into this VOD, I'm just going to kind of let it play, and I'm just going to talk to you guys about what you should be prioritizing when you are raid healing as a Resto Druid. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the 4-piece tier gameplay. What does that change once you get tier piece? 2-piece itself doesn't really change anything, so you can pretty much ignore it when you have it. 4-piece, however, it's going to change your gameplay significantly because, again, as we looked at the logs, you should be switching from Tree of Life as a talent to Soul of the Forest. And what Soul of the Forest does is every time you press Swiftmend, the next healing ability that you use is going to have like an empowered effect, which we're going to 99% of the time be using it on Wild Growth because it increases, instead of healing, I believe, 5 targets, it heals 7 total or something like that. It's pretty close to it. Oh, actually, I got those mixed up. When you activate Tree of Life, that's going to make it heal extra targets because that's what the Tree of Life effect is, which every third Swiftmend pops you into Tree of Life with the 4-piece. And then what Soul of the Forest does is it increases the healing of your next Wild Growth after pressing Swiftmend by 75%. So you're almost doubling the healing value of your Wild Growth, which is absolutely huge, especially when you proc Tree of Life off your tier bonus and then also get, you know, extra targets and 75% more healing on the board with that Wild Growth. So the way that this changes your playstyle is exactly how I was just kind of describing, is you should be using Swiftmend quite often, and then not necessarily on cooldown, but you should be using it in a way where you're pressing Swiftmend to get your Tree of Life to proc in certain key moments in the fight, and then also you should just be using Swiftmend before big damage abilities. So if I like play through this, you'll see that I'll usually use Swiftmend right as like the bombs are going out. So like there, I just Swiftmended myself, and now I'm pre-casting a Wild Growth so that this Wild Growth does 75% more healing as the raid takes a bunch of damage. You want to kind of plan it in that way where like you're using Swiftmend right before damage happens. And like here, I don't think I end up doing it, but I should use this Swiftmend up right here as this knockback is about to happen, so that then I can use this next Wild Growth and have it be empowered for the knockback. So you're trying to empower your Wild Growths that are going to hit the raid when, you know, bigger raid damage is happening and stuff like that. I will say that in this VOD, I do not have 4-piece, and I'm just playing Soul of the Forest just to get a feel for it, and also have video example of like how you should be kind of playing around with it. But yeah, I will not be proccing Tree of Life anytime in this VOD, so you'll have to just kind of work around that aspect that I don't have 4-piece. The next most important thing for Resto Druid, or I guess I should say the first most important thing, since all we were doing is talking about tier bonus, the next thing we're going to talk about is like actual priorities in gameplay, which is the first thing is spell upkeep. That's what Resto Druid is all about. It's about upkeeping and managing certain spells, which in this case, it's going to be Life Bloom and Efflorescence. You want to have them have as much uptime as possible when they're effective. So like here, when we come over to this ad, you want Efflorescence down immediately because it's going to be one of your most effective healing spells, especially if you're running a talent like Spring Blossoms on certain fights. And then Life Bloom should always be active on one of the tanks as much as possible. So there I put it on the tank, and then we want to try to prioritize refreshing life bloom. When it has 4 or less seconds on it, you'll see, I believe it lights up here in a second. There it lights up and like lets me know because it has a pandemic refresh timer, which means that you can refresh it a little bit early and it just adds duration onto the life bloom rather than just refreshing it to its regular duration. So you still get the effective 3 seconds that you overlapped. Efflorescence, however, is not like that. It does not have a pandemic refresh timer. So what you want to do with efflorescence is wait until it actually expires fully and then put a new one back down on the ground. You can refresh it when it has like 1 or 2 seconds left. You're just going to miss a tick or two of the efflorescence, which isn't ideal, but as long as you're refreshing it, that's what really matters. But yeah, you can't min-max it in any way besides waiting until it fully expires and then dropping it down. So that's spell upkeep. The next thing is ramping. How do we ramp as a Resto Druid? It's actually very, very simple compared to a class like Dispriest, who also does like healing ramps. So with Resto Druid, really all you're going to do in order to ramp is you are going to apply a lot of hots, which is basically just going to be rejuvenations. You're not going to worry about too much else. Here, I'll rewind it towards the start of the fight. And you'll see that what we are doing is, let's see if I do it as we go into this intermission. So the main thing with ramping, yeah, I'm going to start doing it here. So you can see me just applying rejuves to a bunch of people in the raid. I'm applying rejuves to people who are about to expire on rejuve. And then we go into this intermission and wild growth, which is basically a ramp. You're just going to apply a lot of rejuves and then press a wild growth. Make sure that your spells are being upkept that we talked about previously. And then you typically follow up that ramp with pressing a lot of rejuves, pressing wild growth, and then you should finish it off with either convoke or flourish. The way that you choose, which is what we're going to talk about next, is cooldown usage. So you can either use them separately. So I will show an example of like what it kind of looks like on a log. We'll go to cast here. We're going to look at convoke. We're going to look at flourish, and we'll look at tranquility. So this is what it should generally look like. So you'll see like flourish is cast and then convoke is cast right after. There's plenty of it. There's no like real specific way of using these cooldowns. It's either you want to split them up like this, where you cast convoke for a big damage event, and then you press flourish for a big damage event, and then you press convoke, and then flourish, and then convoke, and you like alternate back and forth. Or the other way is like here, you see convoke being cast at 508, and then right after the convoke is finished, we follow it up with a flourish. And what you do to decide which one's better for you is for smaller damage patterns where the damage is just like happening very fast and then it's done. So if I go back to like the start of the fight, for instance, we have this knockback in 4 seconds. This would be an instance where you just press convoke or flourish, and you only press one or the other. You don't use both. Like here, if I convoke, the raid's going to be full HP by it. Like right here, convoke's done channeling. The raid's already full HP. There's no point in, if I had flourish available, I'm not going to press flourish here because it's just going to overheal everybody. But if we're on a fight where we have like this synthesize coming in with the intermission, this would be a case where like maybe I start convoking right here as we go into it, but same thing, I'm just ramping up, and then I'm going to wild growth, and if I had flourish here, this would be a good time to use flourish, but instead I alternate with the trank. And that's the other thing that we include is tranquility, which again, you're just trying to alternate cooldowns. So it's like you have convoke for this small damage pattern, and then you have flourish for this next damage pattern, and then you have trank for the next one, and then you have convoke backup for the next one. And you're just alternating through these 3 cooldowns as much as possible because you're trying to cover almost every single like major damage event that's happening in the raid, because that's what Druid's good at doing, is ramping up and covering all of those damage patterns. So the other thing, like I said, is you can combine the two. So you can combine convoke and flourish if it's like a longer damage pattern. So if it's something where the raid's taking damage for a very long time, something like Zymox intermissions are a really good example. Lords of Dread for the Swarm of Decays, you would definitely want to combine Convoke and Flourish, and that means that you use Convoke first, and then you wait a little bit, and then you press Flourish at the very end before all those abilities from Convoke expire. So that is cooldown usage, that's general gameplay stuff. And now we talk about improving a bit further beyond that. So we're going to go to this log here, and we're going to look at we already talked about the maximum uses of Flourish and Convoke, so we want to try to use that as much as possible, which is like that timeline I just showed you, if you rewind just a little bit. And then we have Life Bloom and Efflorescence uptime, so how do we check this? The best way is you can either use tools like WoW Analyzer, which I went over a little bit more in depth in my Holy Priest video, so you could check that out. That'll help you get an easy look on your Life Bloom and Efflorescence uptime. But if you want to just check through logs, you're going to open up the log, you're going to head over to Cast, you're going to click on the Druid you're trying to look at, and then we can see here, we just look at Life Bloom, and it'll say the direct uptime, which is the percentage here. Another good way to look at it is we can go to, we can close out of this, we can go to buffs, and then we can go to all sources, change this to the Druid, and then we're going to go ahead and look at, where is it? We're going to look at Life Bloom, there it is, and there's our Life Bloom uptime. This table right here will show us any major gaps that we had, and the main thing is like these small gaps where we refresh it a little bit late or something is totally fine. What we should be more concerned about is like, why are there big gaps of us not pressing Life Bloom for like an entire minute? Like that's the kind of stuff that we want to fix, because the more we can get rid of these gaps, the more uptime we're going to have overall. And then we can also see which tank it was on and stuff like that. And then the only way to really check efflorescence uptime, as far as I'm aware, is, let me see if this works at all. So this is, yes, this will work just fine. So this shows you the uptime of efflorescence. So we can click on it here, and it'll just show us how much we had efflo down on the ground, which was 92% of the time, which is very, very good. And the way we found that, just to go over it again real quick, I'll just exit out of this, say you're in a fresh log, you go to buffs, and then you just change all sources to the Druid, but instead of clicking on the Druid, it's going to open up this subtable of efflorescence, and you just click on that. And then you click on efflorescence, and then it gives you this table to look at, and you'll see any major gaps if there are any, but this one was actually very, very good. And it also shows you how many times you dropped it. Cool, so that is Life Bloom and Efflorescence uptime, and then the last thing we're going to look at is Soul of the Forest usage, which is something that we should have again when we have our 4-piece, but if you're running it without 4-piece, you can still check it out. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to Timelines up here at the top, you're going to go to Cast, we're going to, once again, click on the Druid, and then we just scroll through this timeline, and we're going to look at all of the Swiftmend casts. So every time we see a Swiftmend, generally, depending on, like, this is the poll of the fight, so we're not going to look at this first one, but what we're looking for is that we cast Swiftmend and then we cast Wild Growth right after, especially when we proc Tree of Life. So like here, we're going to cast Swiftmend, and there's our Wild Growth. That's very good. We can look at another one, Swiftmend Wild Growth. So almost every time we cast Swiftmend, we want to see a Wild Growth right after like this, and we can kind of just scroll through the timeline and just make sure that that's happening and we're not wasting it on other spells. There we go again. So this is very, very good all around so far. This one has regrowth. You can look more into it. Again, you shouldn't be too concerned when you see this. We just want to scroll through and see that the majority of the time that we are pressing Swiftmend, it is followed up by a Wild Growth. Sometimes it's not going to be, because it's better to press a different spell depending on the encounter. And the best way to think of that is, with Soul of the Forest, when you press Swiftmend, you press Wild Growth for raid healing, you press Regrowth for single target emergency healing, and you press Rejuvenation for like really long-lasting debuffs that players have. Like on Anduin, people get the Shadow Word Death, I think it's called, and that's what you would want to use something like Swiftmend Rejuve on if the raid's healthy. So as long as we're seeing a majority of the cast going into Wild Growth, that's very, very good. And I think that is pretty much it. I guess the only other thing, if you wanted to check how you're utilizing the procs of the Incarnation Tree of Life, is you go to Buffs, and then we're going to go back to the table, and we will go to All Sources, we'll go to the Druid. Actually, we don't even need to go to All Sources. We can literally just go to All Friendlies up here at the top and change this to the Druid, because then it's only buffs that the Druid had. We click on Incarnation Tree of Life, and then this will tell us like when it happened if we press on this timeline here. And then now we could go back technically to the timeline and like look through this and figure out where these were. So we can like zoom into this one here, and now we can see this Swiftmend is the one that procced our incarnation tree of life and we press a wild growth. That's good. And then I can reset the zoom up here at the top. And now we can look at, like, let's look at this first one. So we zoom into this first one. And it's just a simple click and drag to zoom in. There's the Swiftman that proc the Tree of Life, and we followed it up with a Wild Growth. That's very good. And that's pretty much it. So I think that covers pretty much everything. I kind of rambled in this video a little bit. I just went over 20 minutes, I realized, so I'm sorry for rambling. I'll get a little bit better about it as we, adapt and I continue making these videos and get more used to it. But thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought about this video and which healer you'd like to see next. I think I only have like 2 or 3 more maybe to cover. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.